Act 1. The Credit Card Trap and the Price of Survival. Imagine you have just spent a decade living a life far beyond your means. You've swiped your credit card for every luxury imaginable, fine dining, exotic travel, and a wardrobe of designer labels. For a while, the adrenaline of spending makes you feel invincible, like a king in a world of peasants. But eventually, the clock runs out. The monthly statement arrives, and the balance is a staggering sum that exceeds your lifetime earnings. At this moment, you face a choice that will define the rest of your life. Do you sell everything you own, declare bankruptcy, and spend the next 50 years living in a cramped apartment just to pay back what you owe? Or do you take a darker path? Do you buy a weapon with your last bit of credit and decide that the only way to settle your debts is to take what belongs to your neighbors? This was the exact dilemma facing the world's great powers in the shadow of World War II, but their solutions were worlds apart. Consider Great Britain, the once mighty empire upon which the sun never set. To survive the onslaught of the Nazi war machine, London chose the path of the honorable debtor. They turned to the United States and signed the Lend-Lease Act, a massive financial lifeline that came with a brutal price tag. To pay for their survival, the British had to liquidate their global assets, surrender their strategic naval bases, and commit to a grueling repayment schedule. That schedule would not be finalized until the year 2006. They won the war, but they lost their empire in the process of paying the bill. But on the other side of the English Channel, Nazi Germany was playing a far more sinister game. Adolf Hitler inherited a nation that was already financially ruined. A pariah state with no gold and no friends. He couldn't borrow from the Americans, and he couldn't print money without incinerating the German mark. Instead, he hired a financial wizard to build a phantom system, a ghost company that issued counterfeit credit to fund the most rapid military buildup in human history. Act 2. The Mathematics of Collapse. In 1933, the German economy was not just failing, it was a statistical impossibility. The numbers painted a picture of a nation that had effectively ceased to function. 6 million people, 1/3 of the working population, were unemployed with no safety net to catch them. The national debt had ballooned to over 12 billion Reichsmarks. Meanwhile, the gold reserves at the Reichsbank had plummeted to a staggering low of only 150 million Reichsmarks, less than 1% of the gold required to back its own currency. The country was a bankrupt firm being monitored by the international community, restricted by the Treaty of Versailles from spending more than a fraction of its budget on defense. When Adolf Hitler demanded a total military overhaul, he was asking for a budget that did not exist. By the end of 1933, Germany faced a trade deficit of 600 million Reichsmarks. They were consuming more than they produced, and they had no foreign currency left to buy the iron and oil needed for a modern army. Enter Hjalmar Schacht, the technocrat, who realized that traditional math would only lead to a public admission of insolvency. Schacht looked at the ledger and saw the end of the road. If Germany printed money to pay for tanks, the 1923 hyperinflation, where the exchange rate hit 4.2 trillion marks to a single dollar, would return within months. If they borrowed openly, the Allied powers would seize German assets for violating debt treaties. The reality was binary: accept weakness or cheat the system. Schacht's subsequent creation was born of this cold, hard arithmetic. He calculated that Germany needed 35 billion Reichsmarks for rearmament over the next 5 years. That sum was more than the entire national income of 1932. He didn't just need a loan, he needed to hide the equivalent of half the nation's GDP from the eyes of the world. The era of shadow banking was about to begin, driven by the desperation of a nation that was out of money, out of time, and out of options. Act 3. The Architect of the Phantom Ledger. Hjalmar Schacht knew that if he asked for 35 billion marks openly, the French and British would occupy Berlin within weeks. His solution was a stroke of administrative genius and ethical bankruptcy, the creation of a shell company. In May 1934, 4 of Germany's industrial giants, Krupp, Siemens, Rheinstahl, and Gute Hoffnungshütte, were summoned to a private meeting. Under Schacht's direction, they formed a front organization, with a deceptively dull name, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or Mefo for short. On paper, it was a research firm with a measly capital of 1 million marks. In reality, it was a black hole in the German accounting system. When the Nazi government ordered 1,000 Panzer tanks, they didn't pay the manufacturer with cash. Instead, Mefo issued Mefo bills, promissory notes that functioned as a shadow currency. These bills were not backed by gold, nor were they recorded in the national budget. They were backed by a single secret promise from the Reichsbank. At any moment, a bank could exchange these papers for hard currency. This was the core of Nazi Germany's shadow banking. By decoupling military spending from the national budget, Schacht effectively printed money without increasing the official money supply. This mechanism allowed Hitler to fund the rapid production of aircraft and tanks, while the official government accounts reported a nation still in economic recovery. However, the entire system relied on a singular fragile assumption that the state would always be perceived as solvent. These bills were not a permanent solution. They were short-term loans that accrued 4% interest annually. Schacht had created a self-compounding debt cycle. As the total value of outstanding Mefo bills grew, the government faced a mathematical certainty. Eventually, these notes would have to be redeemed for real assets or hard currency, neither of which the German treasury actually possessed. The system was functioning on borrowed time, and the pressure to find a source of real wealth to cover these liabilities was becoming an economic necessity. Act 4. The captive capital and the first cracks. By 1936, the Mefo system had expanded from a temporary fix into the primary engine of the German economy. To keep the scheme from collapsing, Schacht had to ensure that the Mefo bills never actually left the banking system. He achieved this through a combination of high interest rates and state coercion. Commercial banks were quietly instructed to convert their customers' cash deposits into these shadow notes. For a bank manager, a Mefo bill was a lucrative asset on paper, yielding a guaranteed 4% return backed by the state. However, this created a dangerous systemic trap. The liquid cash of the German public was being replaced by non-liquid military debt. The banks were no longer funding private enterprises or consumer mortgages. They were becoming captive creditors of a war machine. As long as the public did not demand their money back en masse, the illusion held. However, the internal logic of the system began to fracture when the economy hit a physical ceiling. By 1937, Germany reached full employment. Factories were running at maximum capacity, and raw materials like iron and rubber became increasingly scarce. Schacht realized that pumping more Mefo credit into an economy that had no more room to grow would inevitably lead to inflation. The wizard who had built the system now tried to slow it down, urging Hitler to stabilize spending and return to global trade. But the Nazi leadership, led by Hermann Göring, viewed Schacht's caution as a lack of national will. Göring, who took control of the four-year plan, demanded even more spending, regardless of the debt. The rift was total. The economists saw a looming bankruptcy, while the politicians saw only the need for more weapons. Schacht was eventually forced out of the Ministry of Economics, leaving the phantom ledger in the hands of men who had no intention of ever paying the debt back through traditional means. Act 5. The Day of Reckoning and the First Seizures. By 1938, the 5-year maturity period for the earliest Mefo bills began to expire. The German treasury was now legally bound to redeem billions of marks in cash money it simply did not have. The phantom ledger had grown to 12 billion Reichsmarks, nearly half of the total national debt. If the government paid the debt, it would trigger hyperinflation. If it defaulted, the banks would collapse. Hitler's regime was cornered by its own financial deception, facing economic pressure and rising geopolitical ambition. Germany now needed real assets, gold, foreign exchange, and raw materials for national survival. The annexation of Austria in March 1938, called the Anschluss, was the first major debt collection operation. After the takeover, the Nazis seized all gold and foreign exchange reserves of the Austrian National Bank. This haul, over 200 million 1930s dollars, was larger than Germany's own reserves and gave temporary relief. Months later, Germany occupied the Sudetenland and eventually all of Czechoslovakia with similar economic motives. Germany didn't just gain territory, it liquidated the Czech central bank and seized its arms industry. These international seizures delayed the Mefo collapse, but confirmed a dangerous economic reality. The Nazi economy had become a Ponzi scheme, dependent on continuous expansion to remain solvent. The debt turned the state into a predator that could no longer afford to be at peace. Act 6. The War for Solvency. By September 1939, the Nazi economy had reached a terminal point. The plunder from Austria and Czechoslovakia was gone. The Mefo bills were maturing faster than the Reich could find new gold, exposing the fragility of the entire system. Shortages of food and raw materials were now daily realities. The people faced the brutal choice, guns or butter. But the butter money had already been spent multiple times. The illusion of solvency was unraveling in plain sight. For Hitler, invading Poland wasn't just about Lebensraum, it was a last-ditch financial escape from looming bankruptcy. War allowed the state to freeze domestic debt, declare emergency powers, and send soldiers as violent debt collectors. As blitzkrieg spread through Europe, the shadow banking system collapsed into something worse, a full-blown plunder economy. In each conquered capital from Warsaw to Paris, central banks were emptied, industries seized, and occupation costs imposed. France alone paid 400 million francs daily funding the very army that looted its soil and starved its citizens. That money flowed back to German industrialists, repaying Mefo bills with stolen gold, oil, and human suffering. The Ponzi scheme mutated into open conquest. Debt became fire, and whole nations were fuel to keep it burning. What began as secret fraud now required total war to sustain itself, a cycle with no financial or moral return. Act 7. The Final Audit and the Price of Power. In 1945, the sirens fell silent, and the final audit of World War II began. For Germany, the collapse of the Mefo system was absolute. As Allied boots marched through Berlin, the billions of marks in shadow debt vanished along with the regime that created them. The phantom money that had fueled the blitzkrieg was exposed as worthless paper, leaving the German population to return to a barter economy where cigarettes and chocolate were more valuable than the currency in their pockets. The nation had not just lost a war, it had experienced a total financial annihilation. The Ponzi scheme had run its course, ending exactly where Hjalmar Schacht had feared, in a scorched landscape where every bank was bankrupt and every promise was broken. Across the English Channel, Great Britain stood among the victors, but its treasury was equally empty. The British had avoided the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi plunder economy, but they had paid for their integrity with their status as a superpower. By choosing to borrow from the United States under the Lend-Lease Act, London had committed to a path of honorable insolvency. They spent the next 6 decades liquidating their empire, relinquishing India, Africa, and their strategic ports to service a debt that was finally settled on December 29, 2006. The difference was stark. Germany was destroyed because it tried to quick its debts through violence, while Britain survived as a nation because it accepted the slow, painful reality of paying them back. In the quiet aftermath of history, a haunting question remains. Did Adolf Hitler have a choice? Was the road to the crematoriums and the bombed-out ruins of Berlin paved by an inevitable economic destiny or by a series of moral failures? To find the answer, we must look across the Atlantic to an America drowning in the same Great Depression. While Hitler was hiring Hjalmar Schacht to weave a shroud of secret debt and phantom currency, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was launching the New Deal. The contrast is not just one of policy, but of soul. Roosevelt chose to spend the nation's wealth on living capital, building dams that would light up the dark corners of the Appalachians, schools that would educate generations, and a social safety net that would preserve human dignity. He understood that a nation's true strength is not measured by the number of tanks in its garages, but by the security of its people's future. Hitler, however, viewed the economy as a predatory animal that had to be fed with the blood of others. He chose dead capital weapons that produced nothing but destruction. He built a miracle on the foundation of the Mefo bills, a house of cards that could only stand as long as the drums of war were beating. The lesson of Roosevelt is that debt can be a bridge to a better tomorrow if it is invested in life. The lesson of Hitler is that when debt is used to fund the tools of death, it becomes a suicide pact. In the end, the New Deal helped build the superpower that won the 20th century, while the Mefo bills only succeeded in incinerating the very nation they were meant to save. As we look at the rising debts of our modern world, we are forced to ask, are we building dams or are we building bombs? The ghosts of 1939 are still watching the ledgers, reminding us that every war has a price. And if you do not pay it with your assets today, your children will pay it with their blood tomorrow.